Sup, people. I have a real banger of an episode to kick off my new season and celebrate the 1 year anniversary of my pod that I launched in memory of Michael Brooks last February. That said, my guest today is Jason Storm, the author of the book Metamodernism, The Future of Theory. As you will hear, I've been wanting to interview Jason for quite some time due to my interest in the politics of Buddhist studies and philosophy of religion, among other subjects, which I talked about at quite some length in my last recording over at my Substack entitled A Million Candles Burning. If you haven't listened to that yet, make sure to check it out. In any event, I hope you all enjoy the convo, and I'm looking forward to hear what you all think. Peace. All right, here we are. Welcome, Jason.
It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah.
Excellent. I can't begin to express how excited I am to talk to you. I knew I wanted to go out and actually interview you at some point over the course of this year. But once I saw the recent tweet you sent out that your book got reviewed up at the Religious Studies Review Journal, I was like, no, I need to email him now because I'm super excited about that. And so congratulations on that.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I've been really thrilled at the reception of that book so far. It's been exciting. I think there've been two so far journal symposia. I think, is that the plural of symposium? Anyway, symposiums on the book. One of them was a Religious Studies Review, and the other one was in a journal I didn't know previously, but called Ad Fontes. And I think that there's supposed to be a third at some point, but I haven't heard details about that. And when it'll surprise me at some point. It'll pop up, and then, hopefully we'll see what they say.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, I'm super excited to see that too. And I mean, congrats too. I mean, the panel at the American Academy of Religion as well is a bit of a breakthrough for you guys that have been playing around with the metamodern term. So that's pretty cool as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I have been using the term metamodernism not as long as some other folks. I kind of backed into it rather than worked out from it. I mean, the book was originally peer-reviewed under the title Absolute Disruption, The Future of Theory. I might have said The Future of Theory after postmodernism, but and then while people were reviewing it, they kept wanting to associate it with some kind of movement or another. People don't like, if you're just standing on your own, they don't really know how to take you. And so I kind of had to scramble around or think a little bit about what, if there's an ism that I need to associate my work with, what is the most appropriate ism? And that is when I remembered some stuff I'd been reading, a very long time earlier by this Nigerian art historian, Moyo Okadiji, who was using the word metamodern and metamodernism to refer to artists who were trying to kind of break, fracture, subvert both postmodernism and modernism alike. And I resonated with that. So it's not that I wrote the book with an idea of metamodernism as a clearly defined object in hand first, but rather I kind of came to it later as a second order description, really after the project was 95% done or something like that. So yeah.
Actually, there's a great interview of you actually on the new books, I guess, in terms of podcasts, where you give some great background story as well in terms of how you developed that book and stuff like that. I'll actually go out and put that in the links as well for people to go out and listen to. But I thought it'd be fun because, I mean, the most recent article that I read of yours is the politics of Buddhist studies, which I was reading actually before jumping on the call with you. And I'm dying. I mean, because I'm actually a graduate of religious studies. I did my degree up at the Concordia University, and I focus most of my energy and time actually on East Asia. And eventually I latched on to Robert Bella's work. So, I mean, this dimension to your work, I mean, I find so particularly fascinating, and I'm kind of dying to know how you met Bernard Faure and how you eventually became your your PhD supervisor, right there, if I understand correctly. And what kind of relationship you guys developed. I mean, because his work has had a tremendous impact on me. So I'm dying to
he's awesome. Yeah. So I came across him primarily first in terms of his work before I had met him as a person. So he wrote a book called something like Chan or Zen in the Rhetoric of Immediacy. This was probably in the 90s, I want to say, but I didn't come across it until when I was in my master's program at Harvard. And it was amazing because he was, and then I just grabbed all the other stuff that I could get my hands on that he'd written, and he had written
Okay.
a quite sizable corpus of work at that point. And what was really exciting to me was that he was putting, that Bernard was putting kind of post-structuralist or broadly French philosophy in dialogue with Japanese and Chinese Buddhism. And given that my two interests had been Asian philosophy and continental philosophy, I was like, wow, this guy is one of the few people that is actually doing that. And so I applied to Stanford for the PhD program, wanting to work with him and Carl Balefeld, who was also there at that time, who I had actually met previously, but had and so yeah, and then I wasn't sure if I was going to get in. You know how it is with grad schools. I think I felt very lucky, but anyway, I got into Stanford and then started working with Bernard, and then he got hired by Columbia not that long after I got to Stanford.
Okay.
So it was after I finished my course sequence, my couple years of doing coursework, and then he took off, and so he was a little less involved in the period of time from the end of my coursework until the first draft of the dissertation. Like I barely heard from him, but then he gave me really great feedback on the first draft of the dissertation. I revised it according to his feedback, and he's been an inspiration. And we for a number of years we would just meet up periodically. But anyway, yeah, a really amazing scholar. And what this, working with him became my first book, which The Invention of Religion in Japan, which I wrote under his directorship basically as a graduate student, although he's very hands-off. So he gave me a lot of feedback late, but and it was really valuable feedback, but it wasn't like one of those mentoring relationships where you are in the room with the person every day or something like that. We were on, in different places. And honestly, I was already in Japan and France doing my field work anyway, after a point. And so, even if he had stayed at Stanford, I wouldn't have seen him necessarily any more frequently. Yeah, but he's awesome. Yeah.
Cool.
And for so drop a couple links to his work in the comments if you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, because before actually going back to school in religious studies, I was actually a student of Albert Lowe up at the Montreal Zen Center.
Oh,
So
yeah, cool.
I was knee deep, kind of in the mystical East before actually going back to university. So once I and he actually encouraged me to go back to school and stuff like that. And he was very, helpful. And some of his books got me to start thinking a little more scholarly and critically as well. But once I landed up at university, and then obviously I started to get slammed with much more historical and critical sort of readings to go and stuff like that. And then obviously I came across Bernard Fall's book, particularly Unmasking Buddhism.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to be honest, it kind of destroyed me. It really ripped or pulled the rug out from underneath my feet in terms of the ideas, what I thought actually Buddhism was up to that point. So I guess my question is because you talk a bit about in some of your other interviews, what kind of a family you grew up in and stuff like that. And I was curious if you kind of grew up in a household that was kind of, nightstand Buddhist, or if you were practicing Buddhist at any point over the course of your life and your travels and stuff like that you were doing.
Yeah, totally. So, I grew up my parents are both pretty active practicing Buddhists. I grew up connected to a Sangha, associated with them. When I was 17, I basically did a program that meant I could leave high school early, and I went out to a Buddhist monastery in California, Tassajara Zen Center, hoping to be a monk.
Okay.
My dad had back in the 70s or whatever it was, gone out to the same spent time in the same Zen center. I had to tell them I was 18 because they wouldn't let you get in if you were 17.
Okay.
And I wasn't there for that long. I would say, about a quarter, an academic quarter or trimester's worth of time there. Part of me really liked Zen practice, and I continue to do it. And I definitely think of myself still as a Zen Buddhist, but I wasn't really well suited to the life of a monk. I think the libidinal energies of a 17-year-old didn't necessarily do well. And then I was also very argumentative, and I would want to argue with them on an intellectual, way. My parents are also both philosophers, and so I grew up, in a household full of philosophical argument. And so I would start asking, the abbot or whoever, these sort of questions, and they would kind of say, you're too much in your head, sit down and meditate. And I do think that is a valuable lesson, but it wasn't the complete lesson. And it really reminded me, or helped me see how I didn't want to be a monk indefinitely. And then I, went back to, and then at other points after that, I went to Japan as a lay practitioner and did some Buddhist practice in Kyoto, Greater Kyoto area. I went to Mount Koya and hung out with some Shingon dudes for a little while, and then also in Tokyo, Greater Tokyo area, but not in that level of rigor, not in the monastic kind of model. So I definitely resonate with that. And even in undergraduate, then I ended up being able to make contact with some Japanese monks, particular a guy named Isho Sensei, and he was part of this Heihan Bukkyo movement, critical Buddhism movement, and I found that also resonated quite significantly with my combination of a kind of critical, maybe continental informed or philosophical orientation combined with Zen practice. So,
Gotcha.
And I continued a relationship with him for a few years in Japan as well, but I don't know what he's up to anymore. I kind of lost touch in the longer digital age. But yeah, so I definitely think of myself both philosophically and personally coming out of a Buddhist tradition, and think of the work that I do as compatible with that in some way or another, although I would be resistant to reduce the work, my work to Buddhism. It isn't, an exercise in Buddhist philosophy per se, although Buddhist philosophy is one of my main influences, or Asian philosophy more broadly is one of my main influences. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. And family wise, I mean, was there religion around the house and stuff like that in terms of how you grew up, or?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, my parents are quite active in their Sangha community. My extended family are either basically Jews or Buddhists, and I grew up with aunts and uncles who were affiliated with one tradition or the other. Especially my Jewish family, which was geographically closer to home, because my dad's brothers and sisters lived in the greater Ohio area at various points when I grew up, and my grandfather as well. So my grandfather would try to take me to synagogue, and I didn't necessarily find it super that it resonated with me super well, but I did find myself very connected and strongly connected to a broader Jewish culture and a broader sense of the history of the Jewish people. And like his Judaism was less theological or religious, and more like, here's all the terrible shit that people have done to our community over the years, and here's this ancient tyrant did this, and then this thing happened, and then this thing happened, and then this thing happened. I don't know that he even necessarily believed in God, but he believed in family and in heritage, and I thought that was that impacted me. And then on the Buddhist side, my parents' Zen community is a ecumenical Zen community with a mixture of basically white and Asian, and even one Native American and one South Asian consistent member. They're a bunch of old hippies basically now, and the second generation, my brother is more active and has his own sort of community in that geographical area now. But it was it was good, and we would go once a week or something to do some kind of sangha practice.
Cool.
Yeah, but I mean, I rebelled against that in high school for a while too. Before to tell the story even a little bit further back, I think from the age of about 14 to the age of 17, I broke from it, and I felt like it was just as I rejected my parents' hippiness. I was deep into the punk rock scene.
Okay.
I was at that point I would have described myself as anti-religious and anti-Buddhist, maybe, or at least I wasn't connecting with it very much. But then I kind of came back to it within a more critical way, basically, than perhaps my parents might have practiced it before.
Very cool. Yeah, no, because I was actually reading recently American Jubu, and it's a fascinating reading as well, I guess, in terms of people with Jewish backgrounds that have interesting relationship with Buddhism and stuff like that. I mean, I'm from Montreal, so I mean, Leonard Cohen is everywhere here in Montreal.
Yeah.
So
yeah, he's awesome. Yeah, totally. He was awesome.
And so I mean, his relation. I mean, so when I was growing up, I mean, my dad gravitated towards Cohen. I mean, obviously, I'm French Canadian, so I'm Catholic, But obviously, my parents go out and completely rebelled against that during the Quiet Revolution and stuff like that. So, DT Suzuki started popping up around the house, and then Alan Watts started popping up around the house. So I grew up with that kind of stuff. So that very kind of 1960s countercultural type of literature and stuff like that. And that's what drew me to Zen and eventually led me up to the Montreal Zen Center. But once I discovered like scholars like Bernard Faure, it really, and Richard King as well. Richard King really threw me for a loop in terms of the colonial, post-colonial sort of, and back and forth in terms of how Buddhism eventually became a sort of transnational sort of religion. And I mean, this is where your scholarship is amazing as well. And I mean, I interviewed on my pod Matteo Bortolini, thanks to Galen Watts, actually, who's actually the biographer of Robert Bella. And I had a great conversation with him. And I was wondering, I mean, while you were doing your work on Japan, if Robert Bella, kind of popped up on your radar, and if you kind of wrestled with his writing and work as well on Japan as you were writing your book and some of this other scholarship that you've been doing.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, I didn't, so I got to see Robert Bella speak once. I didn't get to talk to him. I mean, I had asked some critical questions in the audience, but I didn't get particularly much of a reply. But I found his work on early work on civil religion quite interesting when I was trying to theorize how Shinto and the state fit together in my first book. His account of Tokugawa religion and work ethic I disagreed with, but it was still a great book insofar as it had a clear thesis and it was, eminently readable. I think that the Bella that I definitely respect his long trajectory as a scholar. I mean, a lot of interesting stuff. I would say I haven't read, so I read the Tokugawa religion book and, that famous essay. I haven't read everything else that he wrote. I think that the last book of his that I wrote, and this is when I saw him speak, was around religion and human evolution. And that one, I had a lot of things to kind of disagree with at the time. But the whole trajectory of it I found kind of problematic, but I thought that his attempt and his breadth basically and his ability to straddle all these different discourses was very useful, and I admire him as a scholar, even despite various points of disagreement. So yeah, but I think Bella was not like a central touchstone, but I do know his work for sure. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, because I mean, in terms of your book on metamodernism, when you touch on the idea of social process ontology, I was wondering, like how you would relate to Bella's idea of the kind of evolution of religion or even modernization theory. So if I understand you correctly, there's no correlation there. There's no sort of kind of similarity, I guess, in terms of your thinking there, in terms of process social ontology at all.
Well, I mean, I think that what I do tend to see is that, so in that book, one of the, for listeners who haven't had a chance to look at it, one of the things that I'm interested in, it's probably one of the 5 themes of the book or something, which has too many themes, and it's why it's a little hard to talk through. But anyway, one of the 5 themes of the book is about understanding the social world in a new way, and in terms of process social kinds, and which I could talk about in more or less detail. But one of the things that I argue about social kinds is that they tend to be teleological. They tend to have purposes built into them. We often originate social kinds for specific purposes, but unlike grand evolutionary trajectories or accounts of progressivism, in terms of social change, I tend to see social kinds, subject to rationalization, but in a very Weberian sense, in that they can become rationalized toward things that they were not originally intended to be their function or purpose. And the concrete mechanisms of, we might say, reward, and in the book I talk about concrete mechanisms of mimesis, but we don't need to think about that now. But the concrete mechanisms through which the social kinds are perpetuated or brought forward have a big impact on what they rationalize toward. So, for instance, in American sprinting, or U.S. Olympic sprinting, the rules of the sprinting in the Olympics, how they're articulated, change the specific ways that people try and get faster as runners. And so, rules about, if there were no rules about using drugs, then people would, use drugs. If certain things get classed as drugs and others don't, people tend to do those because it makes them, better performers or what have you. Or if there are rules around shoes, they have to, once the footwear gets good enough, people then start to have rules around footwear or whatever. All that is to say that there's a way in which rationalization processes and functions diverge. And for that reason, it turns out that many social kinds, whether they were originally functionally articulated, which I argue, many of them diverge from that. And because of that, they're often not reducible to a single function. And so there's not like one function that religion has served across different epochs. I would argue that there's not, and especially complex social kinds, religion being a paradigmatic example or whatever we're referring to, with the term religion, which I even argue is multiple social kinds. But anyway, a lot of that tends to be, there's not a single functional explanation that covers it. And so when you imagine that it's a unitary thing that has had the same purpose over the decades, often for me, you tend to essentialize the wrong things, and you tend to miss the actual functions that it served, which have often been multiple and, etc. So, I mean, that's a point of disagreement. Yeah. And then and then I have other issues around notions of modernity, but not necessarily, but yeah, and questions about modernization, but those are, orthogonal to this part of the conversation. Yeah, perhaps.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. Yeah, no, I mean, because obviously, you've been pretty involved as well with the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and I noticed that I think you're actually one of the main editors, I think, of the journal as well that they put out. No, in terms of for the method and theory of religion. Method and study of religion.
Yeah, I'm one of the editors on Theory and Method and Study of Religion, but I'm not one of the main editors. I'm probably one of the like bottom of the editor chain. I mean,
Okay.
so they insofar as there are two head editors of that journal, and they do a lot of the more significant work. What I do by being on the editorial board is I do a lot of peer review for them. So I get tons and tons of stuff that comes through, and I try and suggest ways usually to make it better. Or, sometimes I'm the grumpy peer reviewer number 2, and I'm like, this doesn't have any theoretical basis or something like that. But I'm not high enough up in the hierarchy of that particular journal to to produce calls or have it, to shape its direction more than just being a fairly regular contributor of peer review. Yeah.
Gotcha.
But it's a good journal, but yeah, but I'm, yeah.
And I guess because the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and sort of in tension with the American Academy of Religion, is they're two different, very interesting bodies and have interesting historical background. And I mean, because the North American Association for the Study of Religion, there's some people like Russell McCutcheon that are big in terms of the area of theory behind in religious studies per se. And this is an area that you go out and focus a lot of your work on. And during the 80s into the 90s and into the early 2000s, the whole debate of whether religion is even a thing, right? You talk about that quite a bit in in all of your work. And I was wondering, now that, because you're an up and coming scholar, you're really pushing the envelope. Do you think that period is dying now in terms of this kind of idea, in terms of a secular based approach to the study of religion is kind of fizzling out, or has reached its peak, or even kind of a postmodern based approach to the study of religion is coming to an end? I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on that now?
Yeah, I would say I don't think that a secular approach is coming to an end. I think that there's a plurality of possible secular methods to in the discipline, but I do think that a particular deconstructive move, which is the continual reliquidation of our main scholarly categories, that's something that has run out of steam. I would argue. Look, if you look at the actual publication track record of journals, not just Method and Theory in the Study of Religion, but JAR. I'm also on the editorial board, or was, of the JAR up until the last year or something. But if you look at the concrete publications, there still tends to be a back and forth of people universalizing the category of religion and critiquing the category of religion. Both of those, to me, are dead ends in different ways. The universalists basically are very easy to critique, and the critics don't do much positive scholarship, often beyond their active critique. And so you get kind of this binary stalemate in which people are, bashing each other back and forth. My sense is that the generationally the universalists are dwindling, but now even the more postmodern, to use that term in a more specific way that I use in the Metamodernism book, the postmodern or critical scholars of religion, had some great insights, but their insights they're sort of just terminating in critique. So they are really good at deconstructing, and I think that that's useful. In fact, I think it's an even important and necessary first step, but it's only a first step. And so the question is, how do you move past it? Okay, so we grant the non-universality of the category religion. Now what? And the now what part is where I think things have been a little bit thin. So I mean, by the citational numbers, is that group on the way out? I'm not sure. It'd be an empirical question we could look at. But I think in terms of the utility and value of that scholarship, there are only so many times you can just sort of make that argument over and over and over again and feel like you're making a new contribution. And I really feel like it's only parasitic on the universalists who are basically dying out once there's nobody to argue with, who the deconstructionists become even less relevant because their very active deconstruction, is at best a preparatory to another kind of work. At least that's my argument. And I emerged out of, I think you're right, out of the way that the camp would call itself the critical religion camp. And I see my work, my early work was definitely in dialogue with their stuff, much more specifically. But my argument is not that they were wrong, but merely that they didn't realize that a lot of other categories were equally cruddy. So if you think that religion is a uniquely bad category, then you might think, oh, we just deconstruct the category of religion and then we leap over to culture and we just call everything culture or something. Well, it turns out that culture is just a mess and similar mess. And then then you go, okay, where do you go from there? Politics or power. Each of those categories can be deconstructed in a similar kind of way. And then in the Metamodernism book, what I wanted to say is, well, if the fact that all of these social kinds or social categories can be constructed in a similar way tells us something fundamental about the social kinds themselves. And then once we recognize those insights, which I try and catalog or talk through in the book, then we can build on them, and we can actually do more positive work. So, but in that respect, it's not a repudiation of critical religion, but merely a recognition that we can be critical of it in its own presuppositions, and we need to kind of move past it. So it's the same as my attitude toward quote unquote postmodernism more broadly, which is that I'm not an anti-postmodernist. I'm not saying, oh, postmodernism is a bunch of obscurantist junk or, was never any good. Actually, I think that there were a number of valuable insights in that stratum of scholarship I refer to as postmodernism. It's just that they've ran out of steam. They've run out of value. I mean, we did some good work. It made some certain progress in the movement of ideas, but it's not making more progress. And if anything, it has often become so exaggerated and caricatured in terms of its own dogmatisms that it's getting in the way. And so it's time for a fresh critique of it and moving past that. So, consolidate what was good and jettison what was what was bad, and then we can move forward. And so, the early paradigmatic postmodernists were also even a generation older than me too. And so I think it's time the situation has shifted. The movement of thought has shifted.
Yeah. No, and I mean, what I really appreciate is, because I have a huge appreciation for guys like Aaron Hughes and McCutcheon and Donald Whitby. I was going to school once I fell into my methodology class. Those were the guys that we were going out and reading, right? And they've produced amazing work. So that's where I got acquainted essentially with the North American Association for the Study of Religion. But kind of like you, when it came. Well, for me anyways, when it came to go out and start thinking, do I move on to graduate school? I was like, no, this is like a dead end. I just don't see where the hell this is going. And I don't see a future to this at all. And then by the time I was done, I was done. Like I'm out of here. I don't want to go out and deal with that. But now, coming back to it, the work that you're doing now, because I think it's so cool because you seem to have straddled or found a space basically between the new materialists and those kind of guys over at the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and you found a niche in there to go out and start dialoguing between a new materialist and what's been going on in religious studies. So for me, it's like, yes, man, like amazing. And I'm wondering if that's kind of how you see it at all in terms of where you're kind of following within the field of religious studies.
I try and I think of myself as a very broad attempt to do theory more broadly, and what that looks like. I try not to put too narrow a constraint set of constraints on. And I've been, I'm a big theory head, and I've been following all the different kinds of movements that have come out within the humanities and social sciences to the extent that I can find them, not just in religious studies, but I spend a lot of time reading literature in sociology and anthropology and history and philosophy, etc. New materialism is one that I had to work through. I think it was something that had some valuable critiques of basically what we could call post-structuralist theories of language, and and I definitely do try and consolidate the bits of that movement that I found useful. And I think I have a whole chapter basically that you're pointing to, where I'm trying to lift up together both post-structuralist semiotics and new materialism, and try and show how one can benefit from reading the two of them together. But
Yeah.
I think of it, but yeah, that's only, I think, 1/5 of the project. And even then, I would say, what I end up showing is that many of the new materialists, it was a fun movement, it's a valuable movement, but many of the new materialists were merely rendering in ontology the very things that they were criticizing about language. And so, and in the process of doing that, and it's often in very, very literal terms. Like the new materialists were often like, we've given too much power to language, but then they take their words from literary theory, like actant or network or whatever, agency, all of which were narrative, terms in narrative theory, basically, before they were in new materialism. And then they end up describing a natural world that has all the properties that the post-structuralists ascribe to language, a world of incomprehensible flux, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, and to my mind, that they're right to point out the limitations of post-structuralism, but and they're right to turn our attention toward how the world, to the existence of a world that is not merely reducible to discourse. But I think that they're wrong insofar as they, under their banner categories of things like agency and network and actant, etc., they need an interpretive theory. They need a theory of meaning, and they need a theory of causation, and they lump them together and they sort of call it, the vibrant agency or something, agency or whatever. And I think for that reason, they produce they produce a whole different set of problems. And for that reason, I try and solve them. But yeah. So, I mean, it's definitely one of my influences. I think probably closer to home for me in terms of my philosophical background is a lot of post-colonial theory, basically, and decolonial theory. That's and trying to think outside the hegemony of a kind of Eurocentric theory space, even as I read French and German and Spanish theorists. But in that respect, yeah. But I'm trying to do kind of more fundamental work in the humanities and social sciences, and religious studies, although it's the discipline of my original academic home. I'm pretty anti-disciplines, and so I think that a lot of times there's a lot of too much siloing. Like, I think there's a tendency to there's something great to be said for specialization, and we all need to do it to some degree. And it's great if you're excited about something, be passionate about it, go as deep as you want to go in it. But also, many of the academic disciplines have an overinflated sense of their autonomy, their uniqueness, their special contribution. And they don't realize that a lot of folks are working in parallel in ways that are either complementary to them or in direct contradiction. There are, anthropologists who are doing redundant work with what sociology was doing, or there are people in contemporary religious studies today who are inadvertently rediscovering something that feminist theory considered and then rejected in the 80s, or whatever. And I think that disciplinary siloing leads toward a lot of jargon, obscurantism, and work that doesn't have as broad implications as it could. And so I think that there's a mistake about how we're even training our graduate students, because I think, like you, a lot of people in graduate school get burned out, and they get burned out in part because, not to attribute this to you in particular, but people tend to get burned out in part because the very thing that was inspiring and that they were passionate about we kind of graduate school beats it out of you, and then it trains you to do some kind of narrow gap in the literature. And that's probably not the best way to be training scholars,
Yeah.
both if you want good scholarship and if you want functional, happy human beings. It's definitely not the best way to do it. And so for that reason, there are exceptions, and but and I've been lucky to have some really great teachers, but it's not the norm, I think,
Yeah.
from talking to friends.
Well, I mean, the other thing too is, I mean, is religious studies in terms of going out and taking sort of, an outsider's perspective on the study of religion, and I was curious as well with this. I actually had this down as a question because, I mean, McCutcheon and I mean, Aaron Hughes and, the whole crew over at the North American Association for the Study of Religion. I mean, they had on obviously the debate around, is religion even a category? And if it is a category, is it even worthwhile to go and treat it that way? But they eventually got into the sort of, insider outsider debate, right? In terms of, people that are scholar practitioners or people that are, within religious traditions themselves, that are actually picking it up and saying, whether, it's Buddhology or theology. And I was curious, kind of, because you're clearly taking a scientific based approach to the study of religion and a broader picture of philosophy and the humanities. So I'm curious to kind of get a bit of a feel, I guess, in terms of your take on that, in terms of people that would prefer to actually go and take an insider perspective, vis-a-vis their own practices and traditions and how they actually go out and relate to their, particular religion of choice. I'd be curious to hear, some of your thoughts on that.
And I've written a piece. It actually came out a long time ago, but it's in a response to something that Aaron Hughes wrote. But the piece of mine, it's called "Religious Studies in the Jargon of Authenticity," and I
Oh,
tried
okay,
to,
cool.
and you can find it on your listeners can find it on my academia.edu page. I like to put stuff up there because I'm just trying to get the ideas out there.
That's
And
actually where I got the politics of Buddhist studies. That's where, yeah.
so in that, I challenge the presumption that insiders are necessarily less critical and that outsiders are necessarily more critical. And I want to argue that, part of this is also a more broad critique about the question of what we mean by value neutrality. And, value neutrality is a useful ideal, but it is a value itself, and it has certain kinds of limitations
Yeah.
built into it. And so I'm both critical of, so in a way, I'm intervening. Cutting across that discourse. So I think you can be, I don't know, a practicing Buddhist or a practicing Catholic and super critical of your Catholic scholarship. There's the presumption that you wouldn't be would be a mistake, but you can also be not a
But
member of a tradition.
do you think they
Yeah,
belong in the
yeah,
academy? Should they be allowed
sure,
in the academy
sure.
or in
Why not?
theological? Okay, yeah.
Oh, yeah, why not? I mean, in fact, we judge the work on its quality and standards. We don't need to actually add this extra layer where we overjudge the
Gotcha.
person and their motivations for doing it. And in fact, Max Weber, who's in certain respects, the author of notions of Freiheit, so value neutrality or value freedom, argued that one way to do value neutrality was to be open about your values. And then when people are reading the work, they can factor that in. So if I'm reading a scholarly account of Ignatius of Loyola written by a Jesuit, I'm going to, maybe I'll be more suspicious in certain areas, but than in others, but that doesn't invalidate the work. And we all have reasons for the things that we do our scholarship. And one of my criticisms in that essay, and this also carries over into the Metamodernism book, is that there's this confusion about fact and value and what their relationship is and how you produce quote unquote scholarly, neutrality or objectivity. And the presumption is that if you have values, you can't be a good scholar or something like that, or you can't be a neutral scholar. And in point of fact, that, as I alluded, the value neutrality is itself a value, but also scholarship science has values built into it, like values like reproducibility or values about the nature of epistemic norms about what makes a good argument. If I say that was a good logical proof, I'm making a value judgment, even though it is in the realm of logic. So there are all these contradictions that come from presuming that you can push or flush values out. And instead, what I argue is that then these calls for value neutrality can often mask or force people to repress their values. And when values are repressed, they tend to bubble out in work, but in ways that are harder to track and make them in ways more unaccountable. They tend to come out in a key of scorn. They tend to come out as negative values. They, you disallow things. You say, oh, that's no good. It's problematic, but because you're not sticking up for a value. I don't know what you mean when you say problematic, except you think that it's ethically compromised in some way or another, or whatever, or intellectually compromised, and you're blurring the boundary between the two of those, or whatever. So against the McCutcheons of the world, I tend to, especially the Donald Wiebe. How does he pronounce his name? Vibe? Viba?
I think
Uh,
it's Donald Whibby. I think
okay,
it's from the
Whitby.
University of Toronto. I
So, right.
think that's.
Yeah,
I might be
I had a,
mispronouncing it.
yeah, we had a sort of somewhat aggressive email exchange at one point. But anyway, he thinks that he can produce a scientific study of religion by fleshing out all the values. And I want to note that is a value, and that he's
Yeah.
deeply committed to a whole bunch of things. And if you look through his work, he'll use terms of loaded, what are called thick terms, so terms that have both epistemic and value laden language to them all over the place. And part of it, even he ramps up that language in his call for scientificity. So, we can't let those people in, all this stuff that would ruin the quality of the academy. It would be no good anymore. Oh, that's values. There are values everywhere. So the question is not, do you have values or not? That's not. The question is, what are the values, and what are the values that we as scholars need to aim toward? And one of those should be a kind of reproducibility or value neutrality, such that we're not skewing our work toward predetermined conclusions. But that's true regardless of what our personal background and reason for doing the project are in the first place. So you can be a Catholic doing just as great work on Ignatius of Loyola, who is not, as long as you're not skewing your work, just as you could be a non-Catholic who is totally skewing the work to take down Ignatius of Loyola because you think Catholics suck or whatever. That's neither of the, so that your identity position in a way is less relevant. And I also push back against something that I think is happening, I see in scholarship, but especially among my students, which is an epistemic insiderism, which is the presumption that just because you're a member of a group, you know everything there is to know about that group. And I think that although well motivated originally, and while I have a lot of respect for some of the central claims, or I have a lot of agreement with some of the central claims of standpoint epistemology, the epidemic insiderism is taking even any reasonable form of standpoint epistemology too far, and it reduces it to a notion that, because the thing is, like, we're all flawed, we're humble people, we only exist in some particular individualistic relationship to our categories. So, your knowledge of what it is to be a French Canadian is going to have been shaped by the specificities of your experience, and you'll have had different experiences than other French Canadians in a different time period or a different place or a different what have you. And so the presumption that you would either know or not know because you're a French Canadian is one that one could challenge. And so you would then it might turn out, in point of fact, you're going to have more day-to-day experiences of what it's like to be a French Canadian today than people who are not French Canadians. Good point. But then that doesn't mean that in all other areas you have a kind of epistemic privilege. And so anyway, so I wrote an article that kind of pushes against versions of both. But I think in religious studies in particular, there's this really unhelpful insider-outsider binary, which leads toward which is often mobilized against, for example, Islamic scholars who get called out for actually being Muslims, or rather than people who are from Protestant backgrounds whose religiosity seems invisible, and so people aren't worried about them or whatever. And so that's a total mess. And in fact, even the presumption that
But
there's a clear line is between
what do you
insiders and
make?
outsiders. Yeah.
What do you make of the idea that religious studies is nothing but a form of Protestantism type idea?
So yeah, I have a good article about that. So
Okay, cool.
So I challenge that idea. I mean, I'm not in a way that necessarily redeems it. I have a piece that came out actually just a year or two ago, a theosophical discipline about the history of religious studies and theosophy. So religious studies, this came out in the JAR, so the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, and I argue that religious studies has a long connection to basically various forms of mysticism, theosophy, etc. And if you look at concretely at the history of many of the theorists that we've enshrined in our discipline, a lot of them, not only were they influential because they wrote things that were creative about religion, but they often had very creative orientations toward the category of religion and often didn't fit into established religion movements. So I have a strong pushback against J.Z. Smith and his notion of a Protestant discipline. Nice. That said, and you're welcome to look at that piece. That's not, for some reason, up on my academy.edu, but that reminds me, maybe I should put it up there. But that said, I don't think that's necessarily redemptive either. But that's it's just that the old-fashioned critique, which is the anti-Protestant critique of the discipline. I mean, look, all the disciplines are screwed up. They all have built into them the kinds of loaded historicity that comes from being formulated mostly in European and, to a second extent, North American quasi-colonial environments in the 19th century that left legacies of unexamined values and legacies of internally determined blind spots, etc. Does that so in that respect we need to provincialize or decolonize all the academic disciplines, but I don't think religious studies is any worse than any of the others. It's just got a different set of hangups. And then the end goal is not, for me, purely repudiation. So some people are like, you call out the disciplines and then, you argue that the academy sucks and then you collect your paycheck as a professor and go home or whatever. That's not what I'm trying to do, because that move is a little, I'm trying to actually think about how we might, having recognized the limitations of our own history and having historicized our disciplines in varying degrees of rigor, how we might work forward to productively do scholarship in new creative ways or new better ways without these older shackles upon us. And so, and then in the Metamodernism book, I try and lay out a positive program for what some of that could look like. And so in that respect, one of the things that I found tiresome about the critical religion folk is that they were just arguing for a liquidation of various things. So the discipline of religious studies itself, often from within that discipline, and without proposing a positive alternative. And similarly, I wasn't happy with the old school religious universalists who were trying to take us back to, the great days of Mircea Eliade or, whatever, who will note was not a particularly Protestant thinker. Even that how those critiques got layered on each other is an oddity. But anyway, throw that aside. But in any case, neither of those is, I think, a redemptive, is this path we should take going forward.
Gotcha. Yeah. Very cool. No, very, very interesting. Okay. Because actually, I did an interview with Francis Charette, and he pointed me to a lot of actually Aaron Hughes' work, and his book From the Seminary to the University, An Institutional History of the Study of Religion in Canada, is a fantastic read. Since I am in Quebec, because we're just slammed all the time with the idea of French laïcité, right?
Yeah.
So we don't have at times a sort of, even though we have Charles Taylor up here from McGill and stuff like that. He's there going out and advocating for, quite sophisticated sort of philosophy, only almost quasi theology as well, depending how you actually go out and read Taylor. The cool thing about Aaron Hughes' book, and basically he's building on Harold Coward's book in terms of 50 years of religious studies. So he's going through like 50, 60 years now of religious studies. And what I'm so excited about your work is that I feel like we're embarking on a new phase of religious studies. And I was hoping maybe you kind of go out and talk a bit to that maybe, and how you think, or how, now that your book has been out in Metamodernism for a while, you've been doing a bit of the podcast circuit, you've been interacting with some of your colleagues. So obviously you're getting colleague feedback and stuff like that. So how do you feel now that you've adopted this idea of metamodernism? Do you think it's going to go out and hold up kind of long term? How do you feel? Or are you optimistic a bit? Critical, or how do you feel today, now that you've released that book out there?
Yeah, I've been really, thrilled with the positive response to that book. I've been, it's my third book, and it's had the biggest, in certain respects, I've had more detailed and positive response to that than either of my previous two books. And I think people across a range of academic disciplines, I think I get the most positive response from people who are in a precarious position in the academy in one way or another. So it tends to be graduate students or postdocs or adjunct faculty members. I think I was delighted in that particular round table for Religious Studies Review to get some established folks who were also quite excited about it, because I wasn't sure. I'm calling for some changes in the way that the establishment. I've gotten some critical emails from people who are in the establishment who, like Donald Weber or whatever. Yeah. But some supportive emails as well. But I get more critique from that old guard, perhaps. But I don't know whether what pieces. So my sense is that people are deploying it right now, and that they're using the theoretical innovations of the book to do new kinds of scholarship, particularly in relation to social kind theory. But also, some folks in other disciplines are finding the translation theory stuff or the semiotics useful. I think more broadly, people find resonant the call toward a kind of critical virtue ethics as a kind of political politics of the project, or maybe value of the project. I think some people have found this process social ontology interesting or useful, and as a corrective to certain presuppositions built into the way that we're studying our various disciplinary objects. I don't know if the term metamodernism is going to stick or not. Like, that for me is sort of peripheral even to the project. And I imagine anything I argue, I'm a kind of I believe in humble knowledge, and I recognize that there's some parts of my book will probably turn out to be wrong. I mean, it's just I don't know what yet. So nothing survives for eternity. I mean, I think it'd probably be a shame if it did. So a lot of what I'm doing is writing within a certain horizon of finitude. But that said, I think that I'm really excited about the things that I see that are in progress, not just in religious studies actually, but outside the discipline as well, that are relating to that book and picking up pieces of its theory. I mean, one of the things that's challenging, even though there are some established folk using the category metamodern or metamodernism, I didn't write this as part of a movement, and I didn't write it with the idea of, I didn't have peers that I was like, let's all us do this together. I looked for that, but I couldn't find it. And so, I feel like I'm, a little dude with a long lever trying to move a big rock or something. And, to have that, um, even move a little is really appealing and really exciting. And I'm really, been delighted at it. I think the book's being translated into Mandarin, and there are conversations about translating it into Spanish, which I hope will happen. And there's been a lot of pickup in a whole range of, panels on it at the, in complete conferences and and here and there across the globe. And I'm giving presentations about it, different institutions. I did a chapter for the Freie Universität Berlin a few months ago. Time goes quickly. And I'll be talking to folks in the University of Paris system this summer. So it's getting out there. And I think that makes me more optimistic, maybe, because, but I think I'm also hitting a zeitgeist shift. So folks were pretty burned out on a lot of the postmodern theory, and they've been hunting for alternatives. I think that the only kind of robust alternative to come out first was the new materialism, but that's sort of spent its energy, my sense is, although some people are still doing it. And otherwise, people wanted something else. And so this Metamodernism book is at least coming into that space, making a rigorous, self-consistent, or at least as much as I can, account of an alternative model.
And but because in certain pockets online, I mean, it's being picked up kind of as a quasi movement. And clearly, I mean, you're coming at it much more from an academic, scholarly perspective. You and Linda, in particular, in terms of the work that you guys have been doing. And I listened to your interview, obviously, with Brendan Dempsey, but I mean, Brendan Dempsey is coming out of the integral movement and some stuff in terms of more popular takes in terms of metamodernism. And I was curious to kind of get your take on that. If it does take off, kind of culturally or in terms of this particular movement, how do you think you would handle it as a scholar, in terms of that's, because these things can go out and take on a life of their own, right?
Yeah, and they often do, so you kind of lose control of them. Like, Derrida, lost control of the word deconstruction pretty quickly after he put it out there, or that particular formulation. I think that they're, for things to live, they have to be able to grow and change in ways that I can't anticipate. But it is exciting. And I do think, that the other folks using the term metamodernism, I have some necessary affinities with, for sure. I mean, I think that our projects differ insofar as often they're trying to describe a particular aspect of our moment as metamodern or not metamodern. That's not the game I'm particularly interested in.
Well, what about the idea of so-called metamodern spirituality?
Right, and that's not something I'm particularly invested in. Although Brendan's doing it, and good for him. And I'm excited that people are figuring out what that might mean. But it's not central to my project. I think I'm much more within within a kind of philosophical forum. I mean, the same thing with Linda. I mean, Linda's basically trying to sort things into the camp of, postmodern, metamodern, modern. That's not my game either. And I think that
Yeah.
there's some limitations behind that. But I do share with all those folk a frustration with the limitations of the categories of postmodernism and modernism. And
Mm,
so in that respect, they're natural conversation partners. And I've been really excited about how folks in the pre-existing metamodernism scene have dealt with my work, kind of propping up as it is in cutting across some of their discourses.
yeah.
But I think, what it points to, though, is something that's important, which is that for a movement to exist or function, it needs to take on legs. It needs to, have a kind of praxis associated with it. It needs to exist, needs to, appear in the streets. But by the time it does that, the academics who might have been involved in certain versions of its formulation necessarily have to lose control of it. So, I don't know. Like, I hope, that it'll have a positive life out there, and I wouldn't be pushing it forward if I didn't think so. But there's a strong tendency for scholarly, well thought out, in deeply reasoned scholarly categories to get grabbed hold of in the popular arena and either be transformed into something even better than the scholar originally imagined, or perhaps more often be exaggerated to the point of caricature where it kind of becomes crud. So
Gotcha.
we'll see which way it
Yeah.
goes. I don't know. Like
Cool. Well,
yeah.
because I interviewed Galen Watts, and Galen actually reviewed your book in terms of disenchantment. And
Yeah.
I had Matt McManus on my podcast as well, who's been doing a lot of writing on the idea of postmodern conservatism. But he ventures in quite a bit in terms of the area of religion as well, because of kind of like there's this huge sort of sense of dissatisfaction out there for a lot of people. People are kind of completely disenchanted, right? So your work speaks to that, hey, guess what, guys, like things aren't that disenchanted. I mean, magic is still there, religion is still there. So Galen and Matt take two different sort of approaches in terms of how they're trying to go and kind of address that, kind of the way, I guess, Brendan is in terms of, kind of coming up with this new category, metamodern spirituality. Um, and but Galen goes out and refers to it as an extension of sort of romantic liberalism. And so I guess my kind of question to you is that, I mean, like, because obviously you can go out and take a sort of scholarly type based approach, but I guess how do you kind of fall on the political spectrum in terms of how you're viewing all of this stuff? Is there any politics behind kind of what you're doing? Because some people are actually kind of co-opting the idea of metamodernism in terms of actually some sort of political project as well, not just some form of either new religion. And I was curious to just get maybe a few of your thoughts on that too.
Yeah, so in the first case, I know I have Galen Watts's The Spiritual Turn book in my massive to read pile. So I
Okay.
haven't read it yet, but I've been looking forward to reading that. I know of Matt McManus, but I have not read him, so I don't know what his I don't yeah I can't comment specifically on his project or what he's doing with it. Yeah, my work definitely has emerges from a politics for sure. It emerges from a I'm very much left wing from a emerging from a left that is very dissatisfied with the center left, that as it's particularly articulated in our Biden Harris moment in the United States. But
Yeah.
definitely. So the other way, let me give you a couple other coordinates, or your listeners a couple other coordinates that might give you some help. What there's one version of a left-of argument is a broadly speaking pessimistic one. There are
Mm.
versions of this across the spectrum. I don't know, climate extinction or whatever, where or whatever other. There are variations of them in all the main forms of political issues. And I think my biggest response is one that is critical of that orientation within the political discourse, especially within the United States. And I understand why people are pessimistic about shit, because there are a lot of things that profoundly suck in global North American politics more broadly, and more specifically within the United States. It can be easy to lose hope, but the various politics of pessimism turn out not to be able to turn out to be versions of the kind of postmodern dead end that I identify in scholarship as, good critique, but you can't end it there, right? And so these are like questions about, the history of the United States, for instance, and so I also find myself critical of the celebratory optimism of the center-left Steven Pinkers of the world, who
Yeah.
want to say, everything just keeps getting better and how great was the Enlightenment or something like that. That is also not a solution, in part because it involves an unbelievable amount of self-deception, and ignorance about colonialism and the global history more broadly, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Who is suffering, and how the suffering is being accounted for is all sorts of, has a lot of blind spots built into it. But against both of those, what I want to suggest is that we begin by recognizing all the terrible things that are in our history, but we don't allow our politics to terminate in merely the recognition of suffering. We start from the recognition of suffering, but we don't end there. And for that reason, we have to call ourselves to task to not only recognize that there's a lot of injustice in the world, but also that we need to be able to formulate ways of building a more just and more flourishing society. And so for that reason, I have a more positive project, and you can read it in the end of the Metamodernism book, but I kind of draw together it's perhaps in certain respects the least philosophically innovative part of the book, maybe, but I draw together two bodies of work: critical theory, which include critical race and critical gender studies within that broader umbrella, which helps us focus on contemporary forms of injustice, etc. But then that kind of work tends to terminate in basically dystopia, and I think it's good at calling out the current moment again. But as I was saying, we can't end there, and plus. To that, I add a kind of virtue ethical tradition, which I'm drawing from the Aristotelian tradition, but also Buddhist thinkers like Shantideva and Confucius, perhaps, or quote unquote Confucius, and so on. A whole range of non-European thinkers who I think make persuasive cases for calls for particular thickened notions of human flourishing. Because I want to argue, and what happens if you put those two things together? Well, on the one hand, the idea that everything would be just great if everybody was a middle class, quote unquote, white person, it just is a fallacy, because actually, if not only that would be an improvement on the socioeconomic conditions of a lot of people, but a lot of middle class white folk are suffering and are unhappy, and our lives are terminating in a bunch of different ways as well. And so, and merely economic access turns out not to be what it is necessary for living a fully flourishing and fulfilling life. We cannot merely intervene at the level of jobs, although obviously jobs are important. We can't merely intervene in terms of tax credits and think that we're going to solve all the problems in the United States. Rather, we need to learn and encourage. Well, we need to, I'll phrase this slightly differently. We need to find ways to facilitate folks who are searching for a more flourishing, more fulfilling lives. And not just for humans, but I argue for a kind of multi-species flourishing, a pluralistic, but within a certain spectrum, a kind of flourishing that I think we can work toward. There's a kind of brighter future possible if we can direct our efforts toward it. And it's a bright future that includes a broader kind of way that people can live lives worth having lived, rather than merely pegging their identities and to certain kinds of economic models. The other way you could put it.
No, yeah, no, for sure. Because I mean, the Metamodernism book, in terms of how you end it, I mean, the idea of focusing in on human flourishing is fantastic. I mean, that's kind of also what Matt McManus actually goes out and focuses quite a bit on, and so does Galen, in terms of we need to be focusing on human flourishing. And they talk a lot about like how the left is kind of failing to actually go out and address the the idea of meaning. So now all of a sudden you have these people like Jordan Peterson out there that are kind of drumming up the beat for the right, and that. And in fact, I mean, that's Matt McManus's critique, or his diagnosis of it, is that basically there's a new right, or a postmodern conservative right, that is that has risen up basically as a sort of reactionary force basically to what has been going on the so-called postmodern left for these last couple of decades, right? And he, I mean, obviously he's very familiar with the new materialism, which I think is fantastic, which is very conversant with your take. So the fact that you're picking up on the new materialism, the idea of human flourishing, and he's picking up on a sort of new agenda to go out and say that the left needs to go out and develop a healthy version or a healthy relationship to religion. And I was kind of curious to kind of go out and get your take on that, or whether you think that's kind of what you're accomplishing, or is that something that might actually go out and possibly be addressed through your work on metamodernism?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that the left needs to have change its well, there are different versions of the left, but that the contemporary left has a huge blind spot around the category religion. And I do think that the presumptive secularism or laicite of the left often does it a huge disservice. And I think even more importantly, I think I probably share with these guys a sense that a lot of the old postmodernism continues to live on in the right as well as the left, whether
Yes.
that's, and so, in perhaps a very vulgarized form, but, and I think, so I think I definitely see my work as calling for value. And now whether that value is going to fit within institutionalized religion, or whether it's going to fit within, the spiritual turn that Watts talks about, or whether it's going to fit in how people are going to find it, I don't want to overdetermine. It may turn out that people are happy, religion is part of that, but I bet there might be plenty of other places that people might go to for that. So but I think at the very least, the idea that we should be aggressively secularist and alienate religious folks is not a winning strategy. I think that that's no good. And the idea that the only kind of values we can stick up for are negative values, in other words, isms that we call out, as important as calling out those isms is, racism, sexism, homophobia, etc. It's important to call that stuff out, but we also have to have positive things that we stick up for too. And I hear very little positive formulations on the contemporary left. It's all, critical and very little celebration. And that gives people very little to work toward. And I think we also there's a long history of political science showing how basically cynicism and, negativity don't make for good politics. And so if you want to understand some of the limitations of the left, we can see how that discourse is, broadly insufficient. Not that it's not important to call out that shit, but it's not enough, and we need positive things to be calling for. And the anemic language of diversity, equity, and inclusion, I mean, that language is so thin and so anemic, it means so little. I mean, Raytheon believes in equity or what, like crud like that. I mean, it is, Raytheon being a massive defense contractor, they'll quote, their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. That shows you that that those terms aren't meaning very much, or not doing very much work in our contemporary world. Not that they're bad, or not that their original formulation was bad, but that rather they're just have been stripped of all relevant meaning, so that they then become a thing that, I don't know, corporate and academic administrators spout off with very little commitment to anything serious. So I think that's part of it. And I think also that there's an over tendency upon in political action to focus almost exclusively on language and to do a ton of language policing. And I think that often can detract from the communities we're even trying to help. I mean, I'm not to say that some of that, wasn't a good thing. And, there's a sort of minimal level of, getting rid of actively racist or whatever formulations that we can do, and we mostly have done. But the continual parade of preferred terms that shift every 5 or 6 years from one field to another, that is a waste of our political energy. And we should be spending much more time focusing on the communities that are being disadvantaged and which are suffering, which often, don't give a shit about what terms we're using, and at least not as much as they would like to have water that they can drink and stuff without chemicals leaching into it or what have you. And so for that reason, also that there's a tendency for vocabularies to originate within the middle class or academic left that is supposed to be used to refer to communities that themselves don't use that language. Like, for instance, in the United States, we most of the people who I know who are um, you know indigenous refer to themselves as Indians, not whatever the latest politically
Correct. Yeah.
correct term for that is. And and sensitivity, listening to that, listening to what terms are communities actually using to describe themselves, not what term do academics think is the more politically correct term. That would be a little bit helpful. Or Latinx, for instance, which, although well-minded as an activist term, really is not the main way that people understand their identity, and it's actually alienating to Spanish speakers often to use that formulation. So all that, again, some
Well, I
language,
mean,
don't get me wrong, some language activism is important, but yeah.
But this is stuff that Slavoj Zizek has said quite a bit as well, basically, in terms of the work. I mean, and I guess, and Matt
Although
McManus bills, I'd be curious to kind of, I guess, I'd be curious to hear just a few words, I guess, from you in terms of Slavoj Zizek and his overall body of work real fast. I mean, what's your impression and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, he's very witty. I really liked his Sublime Object of Ideology, which is probably, I think it was his first book released in English. It's a classic. He repeats kind of the same argument over and over again, and in ways that I think in certain respects are increasingly suspect. So what he likes to do is say something that sounds really provocative, and then you push into it, and then he doesn't really mean it. Like when he was, telling people to vote for Trump, and then people asked him, well, did you really want people to vote for Trump? And then he was like, no, really, I obviously didn't want that. And you're like, dude, why did you say that? Or I don't know, he has a piece that's circulating now that has what to me at first pass looks like transphobic language in it, and he's trying to push buttons, but then he's also has some sensible things to say elsewhere in the same piece. So like it's I think he likes to get attention, and a lot of his stuff is very unserious if you push into it. He's very witty, and I give him hands down that. And I've seen him speak a few times, and he's like a stand-up comedian. He's fabulous. Like the audience he's awkward in a way that is very relatable, and the audience, you laugh, and there are not very many academic speakers who have that skill. But I'm also not, as much as I fully appreciate Zizek's critique of certain things, for instance, capitalism and its ability to assimilate resistance or to build in resistance to capitalism. He also has this weird, he had this Christians and I forget what his formulation was, but like evangelicals and Marxists against the New Age. He has a lot of anti-European Buddhism stuff in there that I think is really misguided and weak. And makes an easy fall guy for him, because he hasn't know what he's talking about, basically. And in fact, there are ways in which his notion of European, quote unquote, European Buddhism is actually at the heart of a kind of intentional blind spot in his Lacanian theory. I could go into more detail than that, but I'll just say,
from the Buddhist studies standpoint, he kind of critiques this kind of idea of mindfulness, right? That there's this new agey Buddhism that's out there. And I mean, most scholars, go out and critique that. I mean, somebody like Bernard Faure or somebody like yourself, they're very aware of these particular movements and stuff like that, or whether we call it, modern Buddhism and its various flavors in terms of how it, came to North America and stuff like that. There's some excellent critiques out there that go out and deconstruct that sort of idea of what Buddhism is, but yet, it doesn't go far enough, like you say, to go out and address some of the deeper elements of, of what the Buddhist tradition is, or, any religious tradition for that matter. So, that's why I've been much more drawn to, scholars like yourself and stuff like that. But that's cool too to know. Because I haven't heard you talk about that on either other podcasts and stuff like that. And since interviewing Galen and McManus, I've had McManus actually on my podcast twice. And I even picked his brain a bit in terms of, the idea of, what do you think about metamodernism? And he was like, well, he hadn't read your book yet. I'm trying to get him to get around to read it. And I'd love to kind of see the three of you kind of, in dialogue at one point or another, since I just really appreciate the work that you guys are doing. It's amazing. And
I think that'd be awesome. You should,
it's a positive. It's extremely positive in terms of how you guys are framing it in a certain way. So I see a lot of hope there.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's great. And thank you. Yeah, I mean, I get us all on. We should have a big roundtable. I'm always down for that.
oh,
I don't.
cool.
Yeah, I haven't read McManus's work, but I will. I will if we organize. If you organize something, I'll pull it out, and then I'll be able to say something more articulate about his particular project. Um, yeah, I mean,
Well, particularly the stuff
yeah,
on Zizek. I mean, because
yeah.
he falls in very closely within the Zizek camp. Yet he has his obviously. I mean, he's a scholar in his own right. He has his own critiques of. But I mean, I would not be able to skate with him, and I would love to see a guy like you that can skate and line up against these guys and have good debate and challenge one another and stuff like that. So I just think it's fantastic. And I mean, you guys are so young too, and you're all taking up your new academic posts right now. So it's for me, it's exciting to see there's this new cohort of scholars that are taking root in various institutions and universities now, and that are really pushing the envelope. And I would have done anything to have a prof like you while I was completing my degree. So I mean,
Oh, thank
hats
you.
off, man.
Thank you very much.
Oh,
Kind.
rock on,
Thank you.
man. No, keep it up. I guess, and that's, I mean, maybe we can end on that as well. I mean, what else are you working on right now? What do you got in the pipeline?
So I have a short sort of super specialist thing in the pipeline. It was a low hanging fruit, but it's a book called The Genealogy of Genealogy,
Okay.
which is about Foucault, Nietzsche, race, the history of the idea of genealogy. It's basically academics use this word genealogy in a really weird way. So you probably come across this maybe in graduate school or what have you. Talal Assad, the genealogy of religion, or genealogies of religion. Well, what does he mean when he's talking about genealogy? And it's a particular notion of the way that history and philosophy relate to each other. And it's a kind of what we could broadly call a kind of postmodern orientation toward the relationship between history and philosophy. Although some theories of postmodernism wouldn't use that term, but anyway, and so I'm trying to criticize that, turn it upon itself, and show how it's a vicious circle rather than a virtuous circle. How if you do a genealogy of genealogy, it breaks down, and but it's a more specialized book. It's a short book. It's something that's probably mostly going to appeal to other academics. My wife calls it my knitting book because I was like, when I don't know what else to do, I like was banging away at it. I think I'm at the cusp of trying to really think about what kinds of audiences I want to write for. One of the
Hmm.
things that I've been really delighted about is the more popular pickup of some of the work in the Metamodernism book and also the Myth book. I'm not sure whether that means I need to write a popular trade book rather than a more scholarly book. I don't know if I even can do that. If it's, if I'm too heavily deep in the academy to find my way out of that, or whether it should be. I have a strong interest in, and I've been working on fiction and other things as well. So I'm not sure. I think the fourth book though is going to be this. This genealogy of genealogy book. I have also a background book I'm researching and writing on power because
Okay.
I think that a lot of contemporary political discourse is caught around fossilized notions of power that kind of came to dominance in the 1980s and 90s and weren't very good, and lead toward the idea that power is dominating, but it is also everywhere. It is inescapable, and there's no human relationship without power. And that turns out to be both analytically a problem because as scholars, it doesn't let you explain anything with power. Just if everything is power, then power explains nothing. And as activists, it doesn't work because it actually undercuts political agency and attempts to change society. But the power book is a little bit of a ways out, I think. So it's because I think that the way to solve power, anyway, I have to solve a kind of a bunch of other impossible problems along the way. So I'm contributing thoughts toward that, but I think in the short run, I'm close to done with this book on genealogy, and so that'll come out in the
Well,
shorter term.
well, I mean, I look forward to seeing that and reading that and continuing to keep on reading and following your work, man. It's been really cool
Thank you.
to go out and watch your whole evolution now and stuff like that. And yeah, this has been tremendous amount of fun, man. I appreciate your time too. And
Yeah,
yeah,
pleasure. Yeah,
I'll
thank
definitely
you.
be in touch as well.
All right, sounds good.
Cheers, man.
Cheers.